Torah tells us there is a ritual impurity that the childbearing woman contracts, and there's a period of impurity. She's not allowed to go into the temple, not allowed to partake of sacrifices. For a male child, it's 40 days. For a female child, 80 days. After which, she brings certain offerings in the Beis HaMikdash, and then she is allowed to participate fully in the life of the temple. In that parsha, as it speaks about what the mother goes through, the Torah mentions that on the 8th day, the child is circumcised. Uvayom hashmini yimo b'sar laso. Now the truth is that this law of Bris Milah is already written way back in the book of Rosh. This is one of the first mitzvahs that was given to us. It was given to Avraham Avinu, even before the Torah was given at Har Sinai. We already had this mitzvah of Bris Milah. So why is it mentioned over here? Now, I'd like to raise a very interesting technical question and point out that there really are two ways of constructing a code of law. The Rambam used a certain technique, and the Shulchan Aruch used a different technique, a different method of organization. The Rambam started this way. So there are 613 mitzvahs in the Torah. And therefore, I'm going to take them up one by one. So if you look in the Mishnah Torah, which is the Rambam's book of Jewish law, as you see that the various topics are arranged thematically around the 613 mitzvahs. So you have the mitzvahs that relate to sacrifices in one section, and the mitzvahs that relate to financial matters in a different section, and the laws that pertain to agriculture in a different section. Everything is arranged thematically, basically around the structure of the 613 mitzvahs. The Shulchan Aruch has a different organization. The Shulchan Aruch takes you through a typical day, a typical week, and a typical year. So the Shulchan Aruch starts, you get up in the morning, this is what you do. And as you go through the day, these are all the things that happen. And then once a week there's Shabbos, and then we come to the holidays, and so on and so forth. Now, it comes out like this. Let's say prayer. Prayer, therefore, is dealt with in many different locations throughout the Shulchan Aruch. It's dealt with in the very beginning when it talks about the morning prayer. It is taken up again after we go through much of the day and we discuss the laws of eating meals, because everyone eats over the course of a day. And there are blessings that are said, and you wash your hands, and the grace after meals. But after you go through your typical day, sooner or later it's time for mincha again. So again, the Rambam takes up the laws of prayer as they relate to mincha. Then he takes up the laws of prayer as they relate to Mariv. And then when he gets through the typical day, and he begins to tackle the typical week, and we come to Shabbos, again, the laws of prayer are taken up as they relate to Shabbos. And then we get through Shabbos, and we come to the laws of Pesach, let's say, and there's a lot of stuff that is not related to prayer, how you kasher the pots and pans, and how you bake the matzah, and how you set up for the Seder. And then sure enough, what do you have? The laws of prayer as they relate to Pesach. The Rambam would take all the prayer, the weekday prayer, the Shabbos prayer, the Pesach prayer, and he'd put it under a heading called Hilchos Tefillah, the laws of prayer. Because thematically they all belong in one place. But the Shulchan Aruch has a different system of organization. He's not discussing the halachas thematically, he's taking you through, step by step, through a typical day, week, and year. And therefore, yes, there are things that recur at different intervals, daily, in the morning, daily, in the afternoon and evening, weekly on Shabbos, annually, when it comes to Pesach. And therefore, it's just a different method of organization. Well, what does the Torah use? Because generally, the Torah goes the Rambam's way. The Torah is not a systematic guide to daily conduct. It is a thematic system. And you have to then figure out how to organize your day. So in the beginning, you'll put on tefillin, and tefillin might be discussed in this parsha, and you'll put on tzitzis, and that's discussed in this parsha, and you'll pray, and that's discussed in the other parsha, and so on and so forth. There's no place in the Chumash where you can open up and it'll walk you step by step through what you're meant to do in the course of a day. It's arranged thematically. That's why this question that we pose is really a question. Because if we would be going with the step-by-step method, as the Shulchan Aruch goes, then it would make perfect sense. If we talk about what happens to a woman who has a baby, so yeah, she has the baby, for 7 days she's impure, and the 8th day is the bris, and so on and so forth, and that would make perfect sense. Because if you're walking me step by step through what happens, so sure, that's what happens. You have the 7 days of impurity, then you have the bris, then you have the 33 days of intermediate impurity, and then you have the sacrifices on the 41st day. So it would make perfect sense. The reason our question is a question is because that isn't the system of organization which the Torah normally uses. The Torah is arranged thematically, and therefore to take the bris milah and throw it into this parsha, which talks about the impurity of the Aledes, it's not germane at all. It happens to be, it's true, that in the schedule, the bris does follow the 7 days of impurity. But thematically, at first glance, there's no connection between the two. It just happens to be that these are things that coincide. Why does the Torah bother putting the parsha of bris milah here? So let's begin with some general comments on bris milah. The Beis HaLevi, back in Parshas Lech Lecha, raises a question which apparently was hotly debated, which is, what is the idea of circumcision of bris milah? Is it to remove a flaw from the body, meaning that the foreskin is somehow a defect which has to be removed? Or is bris milah somehow a ritual in which some positive virtue, value, trait is conferred upon the child? Is it the removal of a flaw, the imperfection, or somehow does bris milah add value to the little baby? So the Beis HaLevi says that there is evidence from Chazal that both are true. There's a Mishnah in Maseches Nedarim which makes two statements. The first statement is Mu'usa hi ha'arla, that the foreskin is revolting, it's disgusting. Because you see, Shenizganu ba'ha'evdei kechavim, the idolaters are shamed by referring to them as being uncircumcised. Whereas if you look in Tanakh, an Orel, an uncircumcised person, is a synonym for an idolater. An Oived Kechavim, a Gentile idolater, is called an Orel, an uncircumcised person. The two go hand in hand. Now, at first glance, what's the connection? An idolater is a person who practices a false religion. An uncircumcised person is a person who has a certain physical feature. But because this is a shameful thing, because this is something disgusting, so therefore it is a term applied to the idolaters. So that would imply that the arla is a flaw, it's an imperfection, it's something disgusting that has to be surgically removed. On the other hand, the Mishnah continues and says, Gedoyla milah, bris milah is very great. Shenichrasu aleha yud gimel brisos. There are 13 covenants that were made over the bris milah. If you look in the parsha of bris milah, the word bris is written 13 times, which implies we're not talking about merely removing an imperfection. We're talking about somehow solidifying the covenant, the relationship between ourselves and the Ribbono Shel Olam. And therefore the circumcision is really the seal, if you will, of the covenant. Now, let me talk about each of these statements in turn. Yes?
When we talk about covenant, are we just talking about like land covenants? Are we talking about like when he received
there is a covenant
Abraham,
between...
it was a promise to get the land.
There is a covenant between God and man. And the terms of this covenant, whether it relates to the grant of Eretz Yisrael, the giving of the Torah, ultimately the bottom line is there is a special relationship between God and the Jewish people.
So it's more than just the land, let's say.
It's more than land. Land is part of it, right? The reason we have the land is because of the special covenant. It's one of the terms of the covenant, but it isn't the totality of the covenant. Now, let me just point out an observation about each of these statements. When we talk about the idea of the Arla being an imperfection, and the Beis Halevi himself says a very beautiful thought. If you look in Parshas Lech Lecha, when the mitzvah of Bris Milah is introduced, so the name by which God identifies himself, he says, Ani Keil Shaddai. That's the name he uses. Hishalech lefonai ve'yei samim. Walk before me and be complete. Now this name, Shin Daled Yud, what does it mean? What is the etymology of this word? So the Gemara says an amazing thing. The Gemara says it means Ani Omarti Lo'ilami Dai. I am the Lord who said about the world enough. Stop. Meaning, the Gemara says that when God created the world was expanding. And God said stop, which is die. Enough. You know, from the Seder Dayenu, which means enough. Enough. Stop. And the world froze. The world stopped. It stopped expanding. We're not going to talk to a physicist tonight about the Big Bang and expanding universe, but in some sense the world stopped expanding. And that's the idea of Shaddai. She'amarti lo'olami dai. I am the Lord who said enough. Stop expanding. Now, says the Beis Halevi, when we talk about the world expanding, the world expands in two different ways. It expands in terms of size. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. The universe. But there's also an ongoing development, a qualitative development. For example, you plant a seed, and the seed sprouts, and you have a stalk. And from the stalk emerge kernels of grain. The kernels of a grain ripen. And at that point, the process is arrested. The ongoing development stops, and the grain remains to be harvested, and we take it a step further. We thresh the grain, mill the kernels, make flour, ultimately we make bread. If the process of qualitative development was allowed to continue, the grain itself would have turned into bread. Right? In other words, from the seed, the stalk sprouts, the kernels would have been allowed to develop further. It would bear loaves of bread. But God said, stop. The qualitative development of the world proceeds up to a point. Beyond that point, man is meant to take over. Now this mashal, this illustration which the Beis Halevi gives, is actually a poignant one. Because there's a medrash, it happens to be a medrash Tanchuma in this week's parsha, says that Rabbi Akiva once had a discussion with the Roman general Turnus Rufus, and Turnus Rufus asked the question about circumcision. He asked a very simple question. He says, what is nicer? What is more beautiful? The works of man or the works of God? You certainly would say the works of God. Now, of course, Turnus Rufus was setting Rabbi Akiva up. What would Rabbi Akiva answer? The works of man are nicer than the works of God? Of course, a religious man would say the works of God are nicer. So Turnus Rufus said, so what are you saying? That we have to circumcise a person because the circumcised male is more beautiful, is more perfect than the uncircumcised male. To the contrary, the way God made man with a foreskin, so that should be the more perfect form, and you're corrupting it by circumcising the child. Seems like a good argument. So Rabbi Akiva said, well, I'll tell you what. He took out a bundle of grain and a loaf of bread. He said, which is better? The grain or the loaf of bread? The loaf of bread. So the same way the loaf of bread is better than the grain, so the circumcised male is better than the uncircumcised male. That's what Rabbi Akiva said. Because what is Rabbi Akiva's point? Rabbi Akiva's point is like this, that you're right, in theory, of course, we should assume the works of God are better. And that would be the case if God would have allowed the world to develop fully. The grain would have evolved into bread, and the uncircumcised male would have evolved into the circumcised male. But that's not how God set up the world. God set up the world in such a way that there is something left for man to do. Right? Man wasn't put here to be a passive observer. Man was put here to be an active participant. In certain contexts, the Gemara says that man is called Shutaf Shlakadosh Baruch Hu Ma'aseh Bereishis. He's called God's partner in the act of creation. That means God carries creation up to a point. Beyond that point, man is meant to take over. That's true in the process of making bread. That's true in the process of perfecting the form of the human body. Yeah?
Doesn't the question imply that there is some separation between man and God, in the sense that it wouldn't have been a legitimate answer to say, yes, the works of God, but man is part of the works of God. He's a tool in the completion of creation. He's not separate from it. He doesn't stand aside from. He may stand aside from nature as Tim Surface sees it, but he is isn't he part of the process of creation?
But no, but this is the question. The question is that should man tamper with ideal forms, or should man merely enjoy them as they are? That's the question. Because obviously we're put in this world, and we function in this world. But Turnus Rufus' objection is, but don't tamper with it. Don't change things. Right? If God made a human being with a certain form, that's the ideal form. Why change things around?
It'd be a very strange argument putting out. Okay. You know, considering he has a sword, you know.
But this is the point. So the Beis Levi says that's the idea. That's why God reduces the mitzvah of Milah with this expression Shaddai. I am the one who said enough. Because I arrested the world at a certain stage of development, both in terms of its expansion in space and also in terms of its qualitative development. Up to a point. Beyond this point, man is meant to take over. So therefore, man takes grain and turns it into bread. Man takes the male form, the uncircumcised male, and turns him into the ideal form, which is the circumcised male. And that's really a function of God's restraint. God says, I'm holding myself back to allow man space to function. And therefore, the fact that an Arla exists, we should not jump to the conclusion and say, well, this must be a beautiful thing, a perfect thing, because otherwise it wouldn't be. The answer is that, yes, it's an imperfect thing that was left there for man to remove and thereby perfect the human being. Now, on the other hand, there's another aspect of Bris Milah. Bris Milah is a positive covenant. G'dayla Milah shenichrusu aleha yud gimel brisas. And it is pointed out by the Maral that when we talk about a covenant, what is a covenant? A covenant is an agreement in which two parties become as one. So marriage is a covenant. We understand that the bride and groom become as one in the process of getting married. So the Maral points out an amazing thing. If you take the word echad, which is the Hebrew word for one, what is the numerical value of echad? Aleph is 1, Ches is 8, Dalet is 4. Add it up, 1 plus 8 plus 4 is 13. So 13 is a number which corresponds to oneness. Now, if that sounds odd, I'll point out that there are certain situations where we see the number 13 functioning exactly this way. For example, the Chazal tell us, printed in every siddur, that there are Yud Gimel Midas Shatar Dreshes. There are 13 techniques with which the biblical text is explicated. As you derive laws from the biblical text using one of these 13 techniques. So what is that really? What are these techniques? These techniques really bind together the Torah Shebechsav and the Torah Sheba'al Peh. Now, Torah has two parts. We have the written text of the Sefer Torah. We have the Torah Sheba'al Peh. We have the oral laws that were given to Moshe Rabbeinu. When we delve into a verse and try to extract the laws from the wording of the verse, what are we really doing? We're really taking the oral halachas and trying to demonstrate that they also have a basis in the text. This is what the Rambam explains, that it's the beauty of Torah that the halachas that were already well known because they were transmitted orally to Moshe Rabbeinu, really, if you look carefully at the text, you can find them there. And to use an irreverent illustration, it's like, where's Waldo? Meaning, if you don't know what you're looking for, you're not going to find it. But once you know what you're looking for, you can find it. And that's the same idea. If God would not have given these laws to Moshe Rabbeinu orally, we wouldn't know what to look for. So you wouldn't have found them in the text. But once God gave these laws to Moshe Rabbeinu, so we know the laws, we know what we're looking for, we can go back to the text and we can find it there. It's written right before your eyes, but you wouldn't have noticed it since you didn't know what you're looking for. But now that you know what you're looking for, because God gave the laws to Moshe Rabbeinu, we can go back to the text. There it is. And how many techniques do we have for doing this? We have 13 techniques. These are the Yud Gimel Midas Shatayra Nidreshes B'hem. And therefore, it makes perfect sense that it should be 13. Because if 13 is the number that corresponds to oneness, it really is the 13 techniques that make the written law and the oral law one. We know there are Yud Gimel Midas Harachamim. There are 13 attributes of divine mercy. But the truth is that to translate Rachamim as mercy is probably inaccurate. A more correct translation of Rachamim is love. It's clear from the Gemara that the verb lerachem doesn't mean to have mercy, it means to love. And the Svarim HaKadoshim explain that mercy, pity, is more closely related to the concept of chesed, which is kindness, which is the goodness I bestow upon a person even without having a relationship with that person. Rachamim implies a kindness that I extend to a person with whom I have a relationship. Therefore, a more precise translation would be the Yud Gimel Midas of love, the 13 attributes of love. Well, love, we all understand, is the idea of two people seeing themselves as one. And therefore, of course, you have Yud Gimel Midas. Of course, the word ahava, Aleph Beis, Aleph Hey, Beis, Hey, for what it's worth, is also 13 in Gematria. So again, you see the idea of 13 running through these themes. 13 is the number that symbolizes oneness. And therefore, if we're talking about a bris, we're talking about a covenant, so the ultimate bris is Yud Gimel Brises. There's 13 covenants. So that's what Chazal say, the Gedoyla Mila. Mila is very, very great. Shenichrusu Allah Yud Gimel Brises. There are 13 covenants. That in the parish of Mila, the theme of covenant is mentioned 13 times. It's the ultimate covenant. It's the ultimate covenant that creates that, an identification of God with the Jewish people. So you see, the Bris Mila is both. Now the Beis Levi says an amazing conjecture. Says, we know, forgive me for being technical, that in the ritual of circumcision there are really two steps. There is what is called the Mila and the Priya. The Mila proper is the removal of the foreskin. But even after you remove the foreskin, there is a membrane which covers the top of the male organ, and that is removed in a second step. The Moel peels it away with his fingernail. That's how Mila was traditionally done. There are some Moelim that do both in a one-step process. This is a matter of controversy, but there were two steps: Mila and Priya. Mila and Priya. The Beis Levi wishes to say, and he proves this from sources from the Zohar, that the two steps of the Mila process correspond to these two aspects of Mila. The removal of the foreskin, that is the removal of the imperfection. It is the Priya, it is the exposing of the inner core, which is the conferring of the sign of the covenant on the child.
This is Beis Levi says?
Beis Levi says this. Now, to really understand this, maybe we can put it this way. The Maharal points out like this. The Maharal points out that the arla, the foreskin, is a barrier on a part of the body which is the organ which serves to unite male and female. Once we start with the assumption that it shouldn't be there, so it's extraneous, it's a barrier. The removal of the barrier really facilitates or creates a complete chibur, complete connection between male and female. Therefore, on the symbolic level, the complete exposure of the male organ symbolizes the removal of all barriers of connection to God. That's the symbol. And therefore, removing the arla might remove an imperfection. But the covenant, the oneness with God, is only established through the Priya, that final step. And here we find an amazing, amazing thing, like a fantastic thing. The Gemara says, in Maseches Yevamos, that second step, Priya, was loy nitna l'Avram Avinu. When Avram Avinu was given the mitzvah of Mila, he was only given the first half of it. He wasn't given the second half of it. He was given the obligation to remove the arla, the foreskin. He wasn't given the obligation to reveal the organ by removing this extra membrane. That mitzvah was given to Moshe Rabbeinu on Har Sinai. Very perplexing thing. This is what the Gemara says, that there's a historical development, that the mitzvah of Mila, as it was given to Avram Avinu, only involved the first step. The second step was added later. And this is derived from a verse in the book of Yehoshua, where it talks about the circumcision of the Jewish people when they came into Eretz Yisrael. God said, Shuv mol es b'nei Yisrael sheinis. Circumcise them a second time. Now, in Pshuto, in the literal meaning, it's a reference to the fact, the Gemara tells us, that during the 40 years in the Midbar, the Jews did not practice circumcision. Because they were traveling, it wouldn't have been healthful for the child to be circumcised under those conditions. So therefore, the Jews were circumcised in Egypt before the Exodus, and when they came into Eretz Yisrael, they were circumcised the second time. And the 40 years, Mila wasn't practiced. That's what the Gemara says. But there's another meaning, circumcise them a second time, meaning perform the two-step Mila. Now, if this was practiced all the way back in the time of Avraham Avinu, then God wouldn't make a point of this, speaking to Yehoshua. Apparently, this is something new, because this is the first circumcision which took place after the Torah was given, because the circumcision in Mitzrayim was before the Torah was given. So therefore, regarding this Mila, the Torah emphasizes the fact sheinus, a second time, meaning it's a two-step process, whereas the Mila beforehand was a one-step process. Now, there's another interesting thing. That mitzvah of Milah that was given to Avraham Avinu was not specifically to the Jewish people. It was to all the descendants of Avraham. And Avraham, we know, had children besides Yitzchak, from who the Jewish people are descended. Because the Torah tells us that Avraham Avinu had a second wife he took after Sarah died, whose name was Keturah. And with Keturah she had 6 children. And the Gemara says that the mitzvah of Milah that was given to Avraham Avinu doesn't only apply to his descendants through Yitzchak, it applies to the Bnei Keturah as well. To all the seed of Avraham, even though the Jewish people are only the offspring of Yitzchak. Ki be Yitzchak yikar l'chazar, the pasuk says that Yitzchak will be your seed, your progeny. These other children are really not part of the Jewish people, but they have this mitzvah of bris milah. The Shagas Arya, great Goin, says in the Tshuva that the Bnei Keturah therefore only have milah and not priya. Because for the Jewish people, the command at Har Sinai superseded the original command of bris milah. So the original milah was a one-step process. When the Torah was given in Har Sinai to the Jews, it became for them a two-step process. But for these Bnei Keturah, these descendants of, now we don't know who they are, but wherever and whoever they are, in theory they have this obligation, right? For them it remains a one-step process.
What about Yishmael?
And it would be, it could be Yishmael also, though the Rambam seems to say not that way, because he holds that Yishmael was disinherited, and therefore he's not considered a child of Avram at all. Ki be Yitzchak, Yikar l'chazara excludes Yishmael. But the Bnei Keturah remain his seed, and therefore they have this mitzvah. So the Shagas Arya says this amazing thing, that the Bnei Keturah have a mitzvah of Milah, and that remains in force bizman hazeh even today in theory, but it's only the one-step Milah, because it harkens back to Avraham Avinu, who only had the one-step Milah. For the Jews, it was superseded by the new command at Sinai, which necessitated the 2 steps. By the way, I'll just mention an interesting thing. There's a Ramban in Maseches Yevamos who says an amazing, amazing thing. We have to test this, whether this is true historically. The Ramban says that the Arabs, the Arvim, the Arabs, are not descendants of Yishmael. They are descendants of Keturah.
Don't some say that this is the same person?
Pardon?
Isn't
No. But
the Keturah and
Hagar and Keturah were the same person. But Yishmael was her first child, and these 6 are her later children.
Right.
So the Ramban says that the modern Arabs are not descendants of Yishmael. They are descendants of the 6 children of Keturah, the 6 later ones who were born.
Well, they circumcised themselves.
Right? Which is an amazing, amazing thing. The Ramban says this. In other words, the Arabs claim to be descendants of Yishmael, because they claim in the Quran that really we got the story all wrong. Now, as we say that God selected Yitzchak and rejected Yishmael, and they say the opposite, that God accepted Yishmael and rejected Yitzchak, so fine. That's a very interesting thing. But the Ramban says it's a moot point, because the Arabs are not descendants of Yishmael, they're descendants of the 6 Bnei Keturah. It's a very fascinating thing. I mean, we'd have to explore if there are other sources to this.
Where did it say this?
The Ramban in Yevamos, Maseches Yevamos, in the 4th parak. But in any case, there are 2 different aspects of Milah, and we understand why. In light of the previous analysis, we understand why. Milah as a covenant is only given to the Jewish people. So if the uncovering of the male organ is the sign of the covenant, that certainly is going to be limited only to the Jewish people. And therefore that relates to Har Sinai, to the giving of the Torah, only to the Jewish people. That the seed of Avraham could have a distinction, that they remove various forms of imperfection, that could be. right? That could be a privilege that God bestowed on all of Avram's children. That all of Avram's children, and as much as they're children of Avram, they should not have to carry around this imperfection. But a sign of a covenant, that's specific to the Jewish people. And therefore, Priya, which is that positive aspect of Bris Milah, that only comes from our Sinai onward. Right? The fact that Bris Milah removes the imperfection, that goes way back to Avraham Avinu, and therefore that applies equally to the Bnei Keturah as well. So it comes out a very interesting thing, that our parsha, our parsha is Tazria. This mention of Bris Milah in our parsha is not a reiteration of something that was already discussed elsewhere in the Torah. You know, that is often a problem. Sometimes the Torah will repeat something in many different places over and over again for emphasis, for reinforcement. So one would read the parsha and say, well, we have here the mitzvah of Bris Milah, and why is it mentioned over here? Since we're talking about the childbearing woman, really it's irrelevant, but there's another question. Why is it mentioned here in light of the fact that there's a whole parsha of Bris Milah back in Parshas Lech Lecha that was given to Avraham Avinu? So we'd say, well, let's repeat it again to reinforce it, to emphasize its importance, and so on and so forth. It's much more than that. It's really a whole new dimension of what Bris Milah is. Parshas Lech Lecha is the Bris Milah that was given to Avraham Avinu. It is the Bris Milah without Priya. It is the Bris Milah which is given not only to the Jewish people, it's given to all the descendants of Avraham, even the Bnei Keturah. It's a different concept. As the Beis Levi explains, this is the idea that God says, remove the imperfection. But the Bris Milah as the sign of the covenant, that is something new which begins with Har Sinai, and that's really the reference of Bris Milah in our parsha. And this is a little bit technical, but Reb Chaim Brisker demonstrates that when we perform Bris Milah, we really are fulfilling both. We're fulfilling the command that was given to Avram, and we're fulfilling the command that was given to Moshe Rabbeinu at Har Sinai. And he shows that there are differences. He shows that although in both instances the Torah specifies that the bris is performed on the 8th day, but the halacha of the Bris Milah supersedes Shabbos, that is something which is specifically derived from our parsha. Uvayom Hashmini afilu be-Shabbos. So the Reb Chaim Brisker demonstrates that there are certain instances of circumcision which are only fulfillments of the bris of Avraham Avinu. It's a little technical to go into the details. And he says in those instances the bris is performed on the 8th day, but it wouldn't be performed on Shabbos. Right? Where the bris has the extra dimension of being the bris that was given to Moshe Rabbeinu on Har Sinai, so not only is it on the 8th day, if it's a weekday, it's even on the 8th day if it's Shabbos. But it comes out that we're dealing with something which is very, very special. The reference to Bris Milah in our parsha is the revelation of something very, very, very new, right? Which is that there is a unique covenant. Now, what is this unique covenant? What is the nature of it? Now, the Ramban says a fascinating thing. It's actually Ramban in Parshas Achrei Mos. We're going to read in a couple of weeks. The Ramban says that if you look in the book of Daniel, you see there is a reference to Sarim. There is a reference to heavenly angels. That various nations have angels. The nation of Bavel has an angel. The nation of Paras has an angel. That they are controlled and overseen by a bureaucracy. God set up a bureaucracy of malachim, of sarim, of heavenly guardian angels, and they supervise the various nations. The 70 nations are supervised by 70 different malachim. The Jewish people are supervised and overseen by God alone. Now, what does this mean? It means that the treatment a Jew, because of his chashivas, his significance to God, is much more personal, much more customized. You know, when you deal with a bureaucracy, you know how it is? You know, this is the rule, this is the way it is, we can't make exceptions. You know. And this is, you know, take it or leave it. As you go to a cheap restaurant and you try to order something which is not on the menu, or to mix and match, they tell you, no, listen, this is the menu, this is what we do, this is how we serve, we don't customize this for anybody. You go to your mother and she makes you dinner, whatever you want. You want this, you want that. It's personal, it's suited to you specifically, it's a different thing. The Ummah Sa'olam, the nation of the world to some extent, there is a malach, there is a sar which mediates. Right? For the Jewish people, it's more direct and more personal. Now, again, for us, this is hard to swallow. You know, what does it mean? We have malachim. So let me put it in a more modern metaphor. You know, there is a force which mediates between us and God, and that force is called nature. Because God made a world which at first glance seems to be subject to laws of nature. And the laws of nature, as a rule, seem to be inviolate. They can't be bent, they can't be twisted, they can't be undermined. They function as they function. And if you are not successful in harnessing the laws of nature, manipulating the laws of nature, you're going to suffer the consequences of nature. Now, the law of gravity will 9 out of 10 times work against you. You know, you drop something, it's going to fall. It's going to fall to the floor. It's not going to remain floating behind you. It's lost, it's lost. So, there's nature. For Klal Yisrael is less subject to nature. God intervenes more readily. And we know this, we all intuit this, that the survival of Klal Yisrael is really inexplicable by the laws of nature. It doesn't make sense that we should have gotten as far as we have. Because we have to acknowledge the fact that there is divine intervention, there is divine control, there is divine interference, and that has enabled us to survive. Not that we haven't taken many blows in the meantime. It's been tough. It's been tough. But even kol zeh, with all that we've suffered, all that we've experienced, we should not be here. We should not be here b'derech hateva, if things had followed a natural course. This is the idea that there is a special hashgacha, a special oversight that is provided to the Jewish people. There is no mediating force. It is direct, us and God. And the Maharal says that this really is the symbolism of Bris Milah. As we said, Bris Milah is the sign of the covenant because it removes the barrier. The Maharal says, what is the barrier? The barrier is nature. The barrier is nature. What Bris Milah symbolizes is this idea that we have that direct, unmediated connection with God. Everything that happens to us is for a reason. I would like to offer a conjecture that perhaps that is why the Torah interjects the mitzvah of Bris Milah in the parsha of the Yoledes. The parsha of the Yoledes is a very, very bizarre parsha. The Torah says a woman has a baby, so she is rendered ritually impure. She has to go through a process of purification and bring sacrifices. So what's the explanation? I mean, this is a perfectly natural thing. It's certainly not a function of sin. Why should she be in a state of ritual impurity? We talk about this in other classes. But the Abarbanel says an amazing thing, and it's something we have to think about for a moment. There's a Gemara which says in Masechah Sota that Noshim Tzidkaniyos Einon Bepiska Shel Chava. that righteous women are not subject to the curses that were bestowed on the first woman. The Gemara says such a thing. The Gemara says that Moshe Rabbeinu's mother did not have labor pains. Because Noshim Tzidkanias, the righteous women, are not bepiska shel Chava. They are not subject to the decree of Chava. It was decreed on Chava that she would have the pain of raising children and the pain of pregnancy and the pain of labor. This was a decree that was passed on all her descendants. And the Gemara says that Nashim Tzidkanias, absolutely righteous women, I mean, talking about Nashim Tzidkanias of the nth degree, are exempt. So therefore, says the Barbanel, that any woman who is not exempt from the decree, right, apparently that means that there is something there. And she has to go through this process of purification and atonement, and with that she proceeds. What does that mean? What does that mean? See, let me say what I think it means. We tend to think that when nature follows its course, so we are the unintended beneficiaries or the unintended victims of this impersonal set of forces called nature. In other words, God set the world into motion. He made the world with laws of nature, and then the ships fall where they fall. So if the laws of nature dictate in a certain instance that I'm going to benefit, I'll benefit. If they dictate that I should not benefit, I won't benefit. I'll suffer. But the fact that I benefit or that I suffer was unintended. Was unintended. That isn't true. From a Jewish perspective, that isn't true. When God created the world, and He created the world with certain laws of nature, God was able to foresee from the beginning all the consequences of these laws. There's no such thing as an unintended effect from God's perspective. That means when God planted the first orange tree, He foresaw every orange that would be eaten from the very beginning until the end of time, and that was part of His intention in the act of creating the first orange tree. I had an orange today, right? And that means that when God made oranges, He foresaw that on March 28th, 2011, Eliezer Breitowitz would eat an orange, and that was part of the divine intention when God invented oranges. It's not that God invented oranges and then now there's oranges, so this works out that way. They had an orange. There's no such thing as something which is unintended from God's perspective. And therefore, whatever God created, whatever laws of nature God set into motion, everything is intended. And likewise, when the Ribono Shel Olam made the decree on Chava, and we think, well, it's a shame that it was decreed on Chava that she should have labor pains and the pains of pregnancy, and now I'm Chava's great granddaughter, and I suffer, but certainly it was unintended. It had nothing to do with me. No, it's not that way. It's not that way. Right? When the Ribono Shel Olam made this Gzeira on Chava, so the Ribono Shel Olam foresaw every descendant of Chava, every woman that would be a child, a grandchild, a great-grandchild, a great-great-grandchild of Chava, and that was intended. For those people that had the unusual schus, and this is an unusual schus, not just to be a decent person, a good person, but to be one of those absolutely righteous person, God said, well, that person doesn't deserve any suffering, so that person will be exempt from Piska Shel Chava. That person will be off the hook. Right? In history, we know of one such person. Yocheved, who was the mother of Moshe Rabbeinu. She was the one. And there is a lot of evidence that she was a very special person. Maybe the most special woman that ever lived, because she was the mother of the most special person that ever lived. But I'm not joking, by the way, when I say that. Now, the Maharal talks about this, because the Maharal makes a point that according to Chazal, when the Jews came to Mitzrayim, they came b'shivim nefesh. They came with 70 souls. Who was the last person to be born? Who was the 70th? Was Yocheved. And Maharal makes a point that she is the completion of the Jewish people. Right? The Jewish people didn't become complete at that stage of development until she was born. So in some sense, she is the perfection of the Jewish people. And therefore, she really is something special. And therefore, she is not Bepiska Shel Chava. She's not covered by that decree. In other words, if God's creation would have been, in a sense, impersonal, God says, listen, this is the decree I'm imposing on Chava, and yeah, it'll affect the descendants, but it's unintended. I have nothing against that particular woman or that particular woman. It's just that, if the source is affected, so therefore all the subsequent generations are also affected.
Moshe was born with a bris?
He was born with a bris also, Chazal say. Right? So the point is that then we should expect Yocheved as well to have labor pains. But if God in fact foresees all the consequences of his actions, then it's not so outlandish to discover that there was one instance where God said that we have to give this person a pass. This person doesn't deserve to suffer so. And the Rabbi says, and therefore by every Tumas Yoledes, it must be that there is something. That somehow, it's not just that Chava was afflicted and we happen to be Chava's grandchildren, but somehow we share in the flaw of Chava. And therefore, in the same way that Chava undoubtedly require an atonement, we also require an atonement. And therefore, that's why we have this period of impurity and atonement and cleansing to rectify that original flaw. But what it points to, what it points to is this amazing idea, right? That there is nothing which just is nature. Nothing is nature. It's this way because this is the way the laws of nature unfolded. Everything is intended, everything is planned. And that is really the idea which underlies Bris Milah as well, right? As we explained, Bris Milah symbolizes the idea of the unmediated connection between God and the Jewish people, especially. The idea is that there's nothing which just happens because nature dictates that it happen. Right? Everything is decreed, everything is micromanaged, everything is controlled. And therefore, the mitzvah of Bris Milah is thrown into the parsha of the Yoledes, because if we reflect on what Bris Milah symbolizes, we have the insight which we need to understand the entire theme of the parsha of Yoledes. Without Bris Milah, we wouldn't understand that. Without Bris Milah, we would assume that there is nature. There are laws of nature which mediate between God and us, and therefore there are things that happen just because nature demands that they happen. And if so, the whole ritual of the Yoledes is inexplicable. Bris Milah teaches us not that way. It teaches us that there is a level of supervision, there is a level of management on God's part, especially for the Jewish people, and therefore now the whole story of the Yoledes begins to make sense. Right? The matzav, the state of the Yoledes, is something which is also part of the divine decree. So this is a conjecture that perhaps will explain this parsha. As with all things, when you go somewhere and you reach your objective, sometimes the getting there is more important than the arrival. So even if our conjecture is not correct in explaining the question we started out with, but I think we touched on some very, very important things on the way. And even if the final answer is lacking, but I think that getting there was more than half of the fun. As getting there, we were able to discuss some important ideas about Bris Milah, and I think that the next time we go to a bris, celebrate a bris, and we should have such simchas, I think it'll be with a different understanding.